While millions of people fight for freedom in Hong Kong, there is a group of women forced to fight for the right to have bathrooms specifically for women in the state of Australia. Legislation in Victoria regarding the ability to change gender through self-identification alone has passed the lower house, but the vote has caused rancour within the feminist movement due to fears that males identifying as females could pose a safety risk for biological women. And then there's women's sport, and access to domestic violence shelters also of a concern. Meantime, parents in North Richmond are fighting for the right to a safe environment for their children, with addicts caught shooting up outside a primary school and teachers having to scan the area for discarded syringes almost daily since the opening of the safe injecting room, with dealers now flocking to this inner city suburb. Is this really what Victorians voted for at last year's state election? Joining me tonight to discuss these issues and the opposition's concerns is Victorian State Shadow Health Minister Georgie Crozier. Georgie, thank you very much for coming on the show. Let's start with the North Richmond Centre heroin injecting room, just metres from a primary school. I have to say my first concern is this was an issue, this was an injecting centre that the Andrews government said would not be implemented when they went to an election in 2014. It's now on its way to being implemented, and all the concerns you and I and others raised at the time about bringing dealers to the area, of not necessarily impacting overdoses and other call-outs by emergency services, they've all been proven right.
Good evening, Peter, and good evening to your viewers. And you're absolutely right. This is having a real impact on the area of North Richmond, to the residents and those parents and traders, actually, in Victoria Street as well, have all been expressing the concern over months since the opening of the injecting room. And we're seeing that the issues aren't going away. In fact, the stories are still there. We're finding, people are telling me that syringes are still on the streets, there's blood on the streets, there is severe antisocial behaviour going on, people defecating, urinating in the streets and on people's properties, and then you've got the crimes against the person and crimes against property. So it's still a very big issue for those residents in the North Richmond area. And as you point out, the injecting facility is only metres, less than 20 metres actually, from the local primary school. And many parents have expressed their concerns about the location.
One of the concerns too, the Police Association at the time of this, they call it a trial, let's be honest. Trial is what politicians do when they want to do something but they don't want to tell you they've broken a promise. It's called a trial, but it won't be a trial, it'll be permanent. But in any event, the Police Association were not supportive of the trial to begin in the first place. And a recent survey of uniformed officers and detectives in the area found that 80% felt that crime had increased over the time that this heroin injecting centre has been underway. But also, I'll put a graph up for people at home. Ambulance Victoria call-outs to the North Richmond Community Health Centre, where this is located, have increased exponentially. So even the concerns people had to say, you know, we need this facility because overdoses and other episodes will be better managed if people can come in and use drugs in a safe environment. That has not borne out, Georgie. And of course, we also know where there are drug takers, there are drug dealers, and it's now just centralised the drug dealing trade into an inner city part of Melbourne that people used to go to, North Richmond in particular, for a vibrant restaurant culture, which is, you know, really hurting local businesses.
Well, restaurants are closing down. It has hurt that shopping strip tremendously. But even Stephen Jolly from the Socialist Alliance is saying that this is like it's having a honeypot effect in terms of drug dealers coming to the area, the crime that's being undertaken, the deals, but also what is happening on the streets. And that's what the residents are saying, and that's what the residents are experiencing. And these are families, Peter. These are families who are sending their kids out into this environment, and to say that, or the Andrews government said that the amenity and it would be better for the community, well, that simply hasn't been borne out. And it's disappointing that the Andrews government refuses to understand the true impacts and the real impacts to these families.
All right, I want to move to another issue where I think people have underestimated the agenda of the Andrews government, and certainly didn't perhaps appreciate it when they went to the polls, is this move on gender legislation in Victoria. We know in Tasmania there's been changes to birth certificates, but it seems in Victoria it's gone one step further, and it's also allowing people not just to change their gender. I understand that. If you are someone who is transgender, we're talking about a very small proportion of the population, but it's now just down to gender identification, self-identification, and you are, if this law passes the upper house, allowed now in Victoria to change your gender every 12 months if you want to. And there's huge concern, Georgie, isn't there, amongst women's groups that traditionally would have been aligned to the Labor Party about what this means for access to women-only spaces like, you know, shelters or sports clubs.
That's exactly right, Peter. The legislation's passed the Legislative Assembly and is due to be debated in the Council next week. But many of these feminist groups have come out critical of the bill because they are saying that for the issues that they have fought for decades, to have women and girls safe in safe spaces, they feel that this will undo that work. And we've got real concerns about the provisions of the bill in terms of the serious sex offenders or parolees and prisoners, which the government has been very vague on in relation to community safety. So there is a range of stakeholders who are expressing their concerns about this bill. And as you rightly point out, it is up to the individual who can identify every 12 months. They just need to have a stat dec and somebody to say that they've known them for 12 months and that they can change their identity. And we're of the view that a birth certificate is there to record somebody's biological sex at birth, not their gender identity.
I read a report the other day, Georgie, that 1 in 7 prisoners, male prisoners, are now identifying as female to get access to a different prison, obviously, and there are concerns about putting biological men who just with no other sort of treatment identify as women inside a female prison population. So there's going to have to be built facilities for people that are males but presenting as females, and I'm assuming it might go the other way, but I suspect it's more men wanting to move to women's prisons. And this focus on the gender legislation before the Victorian Parliament, surely to goodness there are other issues that demand the attention of the Victorian government as a health priority beyond these things, because the recent census data, and I have to say this again to make the point, 1,260 people only in Australia identified as transgender. So we are turning the health system and all of our gender rules in the nation upside down for a very small, but legitimate, but small population. What else can the Victorian government be working on that's a higher priority?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, it just shows to, it goes to show the priorities of this government to deflect from the real issues that Victorians are facing. And in my own portfolio area of health, there are health networks that are facing severe funding shortfalls. We've got doctors in Victoria talking about threatened industrial action. That hasn't happened this century. That hasn't happened for decades. And health networks are really very concerned about the risks to patients. I mean, surely that should be the priorities that the government should be facing, considering and really focusing on, rather than these issues that are important, but in terms of what the general community expects, as we know we've got an issue around crime, that hasn't gone away, and yet the government is trying to deflect to these issues, and Victorians, I think, are waking up to the fact that Daniel Andrews' priorities are not in their best interests.
And what's the feedback you've been getting from the Victorian opposition more broadly, from community members about these sorts of changes?
Well, in terms of this particular legislation, my office has received a lot of emails and phone calls in relation to this, but I know other members of the opposition have also been speaking to various stakeholder groups who have expressed their concern, those ones that we've spoken about, the Women's Guild and other women's groups that have said that they've got real concerns about this legislation and what it will do. How will that affect domestic violence shelters? How will they now have protection to legally exclude men who then identify as women? All of these implications and what you identified in prisons, I mean, have they been thought through? And there are many people in the community that are speaking to us about that. I've also had medical practitioners and clinicians also expressing their concerns about how they're going to deal with these issues. So, you know, this is far-reaching, and I don't know that the Andrews government has actually thought through the practicalities and the implications of what such legislation will bring here to Victoria.
Yeah, it's a real worry, Georgie. It doesn't seem to be thought through. It wasn't in Tasmania, and I don't think it is in Victoria either. Thank you very much for your time. Georgie Crozier, Health Shadow Minister in Victoria.